This video finishes Volume 1 of the photo history. This will be fast-paced with many pics from the Peninsula Campaign. Please check the previous videos by following links below, and let me know in the comments if you prefer this pace for the images. Thank you, and please like and subscribe. Expecting strong Confederate defenses, McClellan cautiously laid siege to Yorktown. Confederate General John B. Magruder deceived McClellan into believing Yorktown was heavily fortified, delaying the Union advance. After a month of preparation, the Confederates withdrew toward Williamsburg, and McClellan pursued them. The struggle for Richmond, Yorktown up the peninsula. Guns marked General Magruder's positions at Yorktown, where they defied McClellan's army for a month. A mortar battery that never fired a shot. An elaborate defense. 3 mortars of Union Battery No. 4, looking due north. In order to make it impossible for Confederate sharpshooters to pick off the gunners, the batteries were placed in elaborate excavations. Both sections of Union Battery No. 4. The heavy barge at the landing transported 10 huge mortars all the way from Fort Monroe up the York River and Wormley's Creek. General McClellan at the headquarters of General George Morrell, standing at the extreme left. McClellan is standing between Lieutenant Colonel A.V. Colburn and N.B. Schweitzer. Further to the right are Prince de Joinville, son of King Louis Philippe of France, and his nephew, the Comte de Paris. Camp Winfield Scott, near Wormley's Creek. Confederate magazines at the southeastern end of Yorktown. Tons of powder, shot, and shell could be carried from here. Headquarters of General Magruder in Yorktown. This is a pre-Revolutionary War building on the main street. The costliest rampart ever built. The Confederate earthworks to the south and southeast of Yorktown were reinforced with cotton, which was worth $1 per pound in gold at the time. Ramparts that baffled McClellan. Hastily fortified by the Confederates, McClellan spent a month preparing heavy batteries to attack a position that was lightly defended. The shells and carriage were left behind by the Confederates, but the rifled gun was taken along in retreat. Battery Magruder at Yorktown, looking north up the river. The 5.8-inch Columbiads composed this section of the battery. The pride of Union Battery No. 1, a 200-pound Parrott rifle. It stood on the west bank of the York River at the mouth of Wormley's Creek. Moore's house, about a mile southeast of Yorktown. Near here, in 1781, Cornwallis laid down his arms to Washington. The door to Yorktown. This commanded the road leading past Yorktown to Williamsburg, upon which the Confederates fell back as McClellan advanced after the evacuation. Far from being the almost impregnable fortified city that McClellan appeared to think it was, Yorktown was but a small village. Federal ordnance ready for transportation from Yorktown. McClellan had thought it necessary to prepare for a heavy artillery assault. However, this was a Confederate ruse, and time was wasted. The lower wharf at Yorktown. The steamer Robert Morris is ready to depart. The Battle of Fair Oaks, also known as Seven Pines, saw Confederate forces under General Joseph E. Johnston attack the Union Army near the Chickahominy River. Despite initial Confederate success, Union reinforcements, led by General Edwin Sumner, held their ground. Johnston was wounded and replaced by General Robert E. Lee, shifting Confederate strategy to a more aggressive stance. Going to Richmond near Cumberland, Virginia, May 1862. With Confederate opposition at Yorktown and Williamsburg broken down, the Army of the Potomac was now ready for the final rush upon Richmond. The south bank of the Pamunkey, looking northwest across the lower camp. Here is where supplies landed at Cumberland. White House on the Pamunkey, the headquarters of General McClellan. This house, the residence of W.H.F. Lee, son of General Robert E. Lee, looked east over the river. The heights of Drury's Bluff, later Fort Darling, where the Confederates established the battery that commanded the river and defended Richmond from the Monitor and the Galena. Going to Fair Oaks. Here is a haven for the wounded. The Seven Pines farmhouse, serving as a hospital for Hooker's division. Woodbury's Bridge across the Chickahominy. It took weeks of work to complete these structures. These guns of Pettit's Battery, Company B, 1st New York Artillery, had made it across the swollen Chickahominy. These were the only guns able to answer at dawn on June 1st at Fair Oaks. United States Artillery, Companies C, G, B, and L never made it to the other side of the flooded Chickahominy. Here is Captain Gibson and the officers of the battery that bore his name. Robertson's Battery, pictured here in the thick of the battle at Gaines' Mill. A near view of the State House at Richmond, part of which was occupied as a capital by the Confederate Congress during the war. General G. W. Smith of the Confederate States. General D. H. Hill did most of the fierce fighting that drove the Federals back on the first day. John C. Tidball, who won his spurs on the peninsula. There is hardly a dispatch that concerns the doings of the artillery in the Peninsula Campaign that does not mention this gallant officer, seen here leaning against his mud-spattered gun. Almost within sight of Richmond, we see McClellan's soldiers preparing the way for the passage of the army and its supplies. Near Fair Oaks, officers of McClellan's Horse Artillery Brigade. On the left, Lieutenant J.B. Washington of the Confederacy. On the right, Lieutenant George A. Custer of the 5th U.S. Cavalry on McClellan's staff. Both men were West Point graduates and had attended the military academy together. On May 31, 1862, Washington was captured. Just beyond these two houses was the center of the Federal line of battle, about a mile and a half from both Seven Pines and Fair Oaks. Nicknamed the Red Hot Battery, these earthworks were thrown up from McCarthy's Battery, Company C, 1st Pennsylvania Artillery, near Savage's Station. General Silas Casey at Fair Oaks. He had fought in Florida in the Seminole War under Winfield Scott in Mexico and against the Indians on the Pacific coast. Pictured is General Henry M. Nagley, who rushed his troops toward the front at Fair Oaks before being driven back. Beside him is General George Stoneman, who had been asked to conduct raids against the railroad. Fighting officers of the 1st New York Light Artillery. On the left, with his hand to his coat, is Major D. H. Van Valkenburg, killed in action at Fair Oaks. The 20-pound Parrott rifles of the 1st New York. General Edwin V. Sumner at St. Peter's Church near New Kent Courthouse, Virginia. From the left, Major A. M. Clark, Lieutenant Colonel J. H. Taylor, Captain F. N. Clark, General Sumner, Lieutenant Colonel J. F. Hammond, Captain P. S. Mitchie, Captain Gabriel Grant. Guns aimed at Fair Oaks. There was a lull in the fighting which, it has been asserted, led to a fatal delay and the ruin of McClellan's Peninsula Campaign. Shenandoah Valley Campaign, March, June 1862. While McClellan pushed toward Richmond, Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson launched a brilliant campaign in the Shenandoah Valley. His rapid movements tied up Union reinforcements and prevented them from aiding McClellan. His actions forced President Lincoln to divert troops that had been intended to reinforce McClellan. Pictured McClellan's men drilling within 5 miles of Richmond. 200 Confederate soldiers were captured the day after Stonewall Jackson's victory at Front Royal. Jackson ended up threatening Washington, and McClellan's reinforcements had to be diverted to protect the capital. Here is General McClellan with General McDowell. The plan had been for McDowell to reinforce McClellan at Richmond, but Jackson's maneuvers forced Abraham Lincoln to keep McDowell at Manassas. Blenker's division, composed of 3 brigades of German volunteers, was detached from the Army of the Potomac to assist Fremont's operations against Jackson. In the picture, Brigadier General Louis Blenker is standing with his hand on his belt. At his left is Prince Felix of Somme, a Prussian military officer. The 7 Days Battles, June 25th to July 1st, 1862. Once Robert E. Lee took command, he aggressively counterattacked McClellan's forces in a series of engagements known as the 7 Days Battles. These battles, including Gaines' Mill and Savage's Station, forced McClellan into retreat. Lee's aggressive tactics prevented the Union from taking Richmond and ended the Peninsula Campaign in Confederate victory. 7 Days Battles. McClellan moved his base to the James River on the first day of the battles. Photograph taken after the war of Generals Joseph E. Johnston and Robert E. Lee. Photographs of the fleet that supplied the Union Army along the James and Pamunkey Rivers to White House Landing. Ellerson's Mill, where A.P. Hill launched his assault. Eventually, Hill's troops withdrew, and the Federals maintained their position. Railroad trains loaded with tons of food and ammunition were deliberately run at full speed off the embankment shown in the left foreground. Mechanicsville Bridge, where the divisions of D.H. Hill and General Longstreet waited for A.P. Hill to open the way. They later crossed the bridge in time to play a decisive role in the Confederate attack at Gaines' Mill. In this photo are some members of McClellan's staff, officers who were often required to act as regimental commanders, dividing their time between action and reporting to their superiors. Woodbury's Bridge. While General John Porter was engaged in the field at Gaines' Mill, General Henry Slocum marched from his position in the trenches in front of Richmond across this bridge to support Porter's men. At nightfall, the Federal troops crossed back over the bridge and rejoined the main forces. Allen's farmhouse, where General Magruder led the Confederates in an attempt to seize the supplies that McClellan was shifting to his new position. In the background, the corps of Sumner and Heintzelman are camped. Retreat after Gaines' Mill. McClellan's army was able to transport wounded soldiers on flatbed rail cars. However, Lee was about to strike the Federal rear guard at Savage's Station, and these wounded men were being moved toward that battle. This photo shows part of the encampment that fought valiantly against Magruder. Hundreds of wounded soldiers were left behind, even as many had already been transported by rail car. After the 2nd and 6th Corps of the Federal Army withdrew into the depths of White Oak Swamp, medical officers and approximately 2,500 sick and wounded men were left behind and became prisoners of war. Photograph of the impassable White Oak Swamp, with only a single long bridge over which McClellan's wagon trains hurried in the last days of June 1862. Top row, Major Myers, Lieutenant Stryker, and Norton of the 10th Pennsylvania Reserves. Center, Colonel A.V. Colburn, Colonel D.B. Sackett, and General John Sedgwick. Bottom row, Colonel James H. Childs and officers of the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. This photograph was taken the month after the 7 Days battles. Heroes of Malvern Hill, Brigadier General J.H. Martindale, seated, and his staff. They successfully held off Magruder's attacks on the Federal line. Officers of the famous USS Monitor, which provided naval support to the Federals along the James River. Westover House, which served as the headquarters of General John Porter at Harrison's Landing, the Union Army's second base. Lieutenant Colonel Albert Colburn, an aide to General McClellan. He was responsible for delivering dispatches across the battlefield, moving swiftly from one section of the front to another. Colonel William W. Averill and staff of the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry. He successfully deceived the Confederates into believing that his forces had a larger artillery presence at Malvern Hill, buying time for the Army of the Potomac to retreat to Harrison's Landing. Officers of the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry. McClellan's position at Harrison's Landing was strong enough to deter General Lee from launching an attack. A photograph of Charles City Courthouse, Virginia, taken in July 1862. From this old ruin at Gaines' Mill, the battle took its name. The 1st Maryland Confederate Regiment won glory for itself, and its cause by overcoming a Federal battery on Turkey Hill. The road to Richmond was long, winding through the wet Virginia lowlands. McClellan, a man who saw war as a chess game, landed his great army at Fort Monroe, moving like a careful farmer planting his fields, always measuring the soil before placing his boot. He pushed forward, pressing the Confederates back from Yorktown and Williamsburg, but every gain felt more like a delay than a victory. The land swallowed his men in swamps and sickness. Richmond lay just beyond the horizon, close enough to taste, but McClellan hesitated, and in that hesitation, war slipped through his fingers. Then came Lee, Robert E. Lee, sharp-eyed and unafraid. He struck like a farmer defending his last acre, driving McClellan's army back in the 7 Days battles, hammering at them until retreat was the only road left open. And so McClellan, with all his plans and all his men, drifted back down the river, his dream of Richmond washing away with the tide. This concludes the first volume of the photographic history of the Civil War. I hope you've enjoyed these remarkable images and stories. Be sure to like and subscribe. On to Volume 2, so I'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, and suggestions in the meantime. If you missed any videos, you'll find the links in the description below. Thank you all for watching, and don't forget to set the alert.